It is 4:09 a.m. on March 9th, 2026, and the Gulf of Oman does not forgive slow ships. The passage between the Iranian coastline to the north and the Omani Peninsula to the south is 190 miles wide at the point where the USS Lake Champlain is currently operating. And that width offers a certain theoretical comfort. Room to maneuver, room to react, room to put distance between the ship and whatever is coming off the Iranian plateau. But distance is a function of time, and at 4:09 a.m., the Combat Information Center of the Lake Champlain is receiving track data that is compressing both of those variables faster than the watch section has ever experienced in a fleet exercise or an actual deployment. The Lake Champlain is a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, and she is the most capable surface combatant in the Gulf of Oman tonight by every objective measure. Her SPY-1B radar is the older variant of the Aegis system, but the operators behind its consoles have been running this specific piece of equipment long enough that they know its capabilities and its limits. With the intimacy of people who depend on a machine the way a surgeon depends on a specific instrument, the Combat Information Center on a cruiser at combat readiness has a specific quality to its atmosphere, a density of focused human attention, of people who have been trained for years to process information faster than their instincts would naturally allow, to recognize threat signatures in data streams that look like noise to anyone without the training, to act on incomplete information at speeds that feel, from the outside, almost automated. The watch section at 4:09 a.m. has been on station for 6 hours. The coffee is long gone. The ambient light is the cold blue of LCD displays and the amber flicker of system status indicators. The ship moves beneath them at 17 knots, a motion so familiar after 41 days of deployment that nobody aboard consciously registers it anymore. She is the primary air defense coordinator for a convoy of 4 logistics vessels, 2 replenishment ships, 1 ammunition carrier, 1 fuel tanker, that have been transiting the Gulf of Oman since 1 a.m. under escort, moving toward a rendezvous position with the Abraham Lincoln strike group that needs their cargo urgently. 11 days into Operation Epic Fury, the carrier strike group's magazines and fuel reserves have been drawn down to the point where sustaining combat air operations requires this resupply. The convoy is not optional. The Lake Champlain's mission is not optional. At 4:09 a.m., the SPY-1B radar returns a contact that the tracking system takes 6 full seconds to classify, which is 6 seconds longer than it normally takes because what is climbing off the Iranian coast on a bearing of 035 degrees is not behaving like anything in the threat library in quite the expected way. The object is accelerating through Mach 6 at altitude, which is within the performance envelope of the Iranian Fattah-2 hypersonic glide vehicle, a weapon that has been assessed, debated, analyzed, and war-gamed for 3 years in classified planning documents, and that nobody in the fleet has ever seen in actual operational use until this moment. The track is not a ballistic arc. It is a glide, a shallow descending curve that keeps the vehicle in the upper atmosphere long enough to build and sustain the velocity that makes it so difficult to engage before it transitions to a terminal dive that the fire control system is currently attempting to predict and that is currently refusing to be predicted with any confidence. The tactical action officer designates the Fattah contact as Track Sierra 1 and immediately requests engagement authorization from the commanding officer. The authorization comes in 3 seconds. The problem is the engagement solution. The SPY-1B's fire control processor is computing intercept geometries and rejecting them in rapid succession. The hypersonic vehicle's glide path introduces uncertainties into the predicted terminal point that are, at this range and with this weapon type, larger than the lethal radius of the interceptor. The SM-3 Block 2A is the right weapon for a ballistic target. For a hypersonic glide vehicle that is actively managing its own trajectory, the engagement geometry is not clean. The first computed intercept solution has a predicted miss distance of 40 meters. The system rejects it. The second solution is 31 meters. The system flags it as marginal. The third solution comes in at 19 meters and the tactical action officer authorizes launch. The first SM-3 leaves its VLS cell at 4:11 a.m., while the interceptor climbs toward the upper atmosphere. The SPY-1B detects 6 additional contacts. These are not hypersonic. They are ballistic. Shahab-3 extended-range variants climbing out of a launch complex in Kerman Province. At the standard ballistic trajectory the tracking system knows well. Launch time, approximately 90 seconds prior. The salvo is timed. The hypersonic vehicle went first to force early interceptor expenditure and to occupy the fire control system's attention during the window when the ballistic missiles would be most difficult to engage simultaneously. The Iranian planners have been studying U.S. Navy engagement doctrine for years. They understand the engagement sequencing that an Aegis ship will use. They have designed this strike around it. The tactical action officer looks at his screen and makes 6 designations in 4 seconds. The fire control system begins computing ballistic intercept solutions. It is good at this. It has been doing this exact work for 11 days. But the hypersonic track is still active, still gliding, still demanding a share of the radar's tracking capacity. The SPY-1B is doing the work of 2 radar systems simultaneously, and it is running hot. The temperature alarm for the SPY-1B transmitter array's cooling system activates at 4:13 a.m. Not critical, a caution level alert, the kind that the engineering watch has been monitoring since the radar went to full-power continuous operation at the start of the Convoy escort 9 hours ago. The cooling system has been managing the thermal load adequately for 9 hours. What changes at 4:13 a.m. is that the radar's power output has increased automatically in response to the hypersonic track's radar cross-section reduction. Hypersonic vehicles generate plasma sheaths that absorb and scatter radar energy, requiring the transmitter to push harder to maintain track quality. The cooling system, already operating at 91% of rated capacity, is now being asked to handle a load it was not sized for. The first SM-3 misses the Fattah-2 at 4:14 a.m. The interceptor vehicle passes within 22 meters of the hypersonic vehicle, close enough that the ground stations tracking the engagement register a brief infrared anomaly. But 22 meters is outside the SM-3's effective fragmentation radius against a hypersonic target moving at this speed. The vehicle continues its glide. The Lake Champlain assigns a second SM-3 against it and simultaneously fires the first pair of interceptors against the 2 highest priority ballistic tracks. The second SM-3 assigned to the Fattah-2 launches at 4:15 a.m. The engagement is now consuming the Lake Champlain's interceptor inventory at a rate that the commanding officer is tracking with the focused arithmetic of someone who knows the number of missiles in the magazines and the number of threats still in the air simultaneously. The math has a fixed outcome. The question is whether the ship gets to that outcome with the threats neutralized or with the threats still inbound. At 4:16 a.m., the first of the 6 ballistic missiles is intercepted at altitude. The SM-3 achieves a kinetic intercept and the debris field falls harmlessly into the Gulf of Oman. The second ballistic intercept fires and misses. The missile was executing a terminal maneuver that the fire control solution had not fully accounted for, and it is now in terminal phase, falling through 60 kilometers altitude, no longer interceptable by SM-3. The Lake Champlain assigns SM-2 Block 3C for terminal engagement and continues the fight. What happens next is not a catastrophic failure. It is a sequence of small failures that aggregate into a crisis the way small cracks in a dam aggregate before the water finds a path. The SPY-1B cooling system reaches its thermal limit at 4:17 a.m., and the automatic protection logic reduces the transmitter's output power by 30%. The radar does not go offline. The radar continues to track, but at 70% power, The quality of the tracking data on the Fattah-2 degrades from the already marginal quality it had at full power. And the second, SM-3's terminal guidance, which depends on mid-course updates from the SPY-1B, receives a target position update at 4:17:22 a.m. that contains a 6-meter error in the predicted terminal position. The interceptor vehicle adjusts. The adjustment is in the wrong direction by 4 meters. The intercept miss distance is 30 meters. The Fattah-2 continues. At 4:18 a.m., 6 minutes and 41 seconds after it was first detected, the Fattah-2 transitions from glide phase to terminal dive. The vehicle steepens its trajectory from 12 degrees to 67 degrees and accelerates through Mach 8. The SPY-1B tracks it through the transition with degraded but functional radar data. The fire control system computes a CRAM engagement solution and flags it as very low probability. The vehicle is moving too fast and its radar cross-section is too small for the CRAM seeker to reliably acquire. The tactical action officer authorizes engagement anyway. There is no other option. The CRAM fires 2 rounds. Both miss. The engagement is over before the crew on the bridge can process that it has happened. The Fattah-2 strikes the Lake Champlain's stern section at 4:18:44 a.m. It does not strike the hull directly. The terminal dive geometry carries the vehicle 17 meters short of the hull, where the plasma sheath distorts the terminal seeker's targeting solution. A margin so thin it will be analyzed in classified documents for years. And the vehicle impacts the water at the extreme stern, immediately beneath the port propulsion shaft exit point. The detonation is in the water, not on the hull. The pressure wave travels up through the shaft seal fittings and the stern tube bearings with a force that shears the port shaft coupling and drives the shaft bearing housing upward into the machinery space above it. The resulting damage is not flooding. It is a high-pressure oil line fracture in the port main reduction gear lube oil system, which sprays atomized oil into a machinery space that has been running at operating temperature for 9 continuous hours. The oil ignites before anyone in the space can reach an isolation valve. The fire begins at 4:18:51 a.m., 7 seconds after impact. It is small at first, barely larger than a kitchen stove flame. And then the ventilation system, which is drawing air through the machinery space at its normal operating rate, feeds it, and in 40 seconds it has grown to something that fills the space with thick black smoke and a heat that pushes the thermal sensors to their maximum reading. The ship loses her port propulsion plant. The starboard plant is intact, operational, undamaged. But a ship moving at 17 knots on one shaft, with a fire in the adjacent machinery space, with 5 inbound ballistic missiles still unengaged, is not a ship that can simply continue the fight as if nothing has changed. The engineering casualty control team reaches the machinery space boundary at 4:20 a.m. The space cannot be entered. The fire has consumed the breathable atmosphere and the heat at the access hatch is registering above 300 degrees Celsius on the contact thermometer that the team leader presses to the steel door before touching the handle. This is standard procedure. A steel door that is this temperature will transfer enough heat through a glove to cause a burn before the handle can be released. The team does not open the door. The team leader calls for AFFF, aqueous film-forming foam, from the fixed suppression system, a network of pipes and nozzles pre-installed throughout the machinery space precisely for this type of event. The engineering officer of the watch initiates the fixed system from the damage control console at 4:21 a.m. There is a brief pause, 3 seconds, while the system pressurizes and then the temperature sensors inside the space begin registering the foam flow. The fire is not immediately extinguished. A lube oil fire in an enclosed space has enough thermal mass in the heated metal surfaces to sustain combustion even after the foam suppresses the primary fuel source, and the sensors show the temperature holding for 90 seconds before it begins to drop. It drops slowly, then faster. At 4:24 a.m., the temperature curve flattens and the smoke sensor readings begin to decrease. The fire is out. The space is full of foam and residual combustion products that will take another 20 minutes to clear to breathable levels. But the fire has been burning for 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and in that time, the port main reduction gear has sustained thermal damage that has permanently deformed the gear case housing. Even if the fire is completely extinguished and the lube oil system is repressurized, the port shaft cannot be returned to service. The Lake Champlain is a one-shaft ship for the rest of this engagement. Her maximum speed is now 14 knots. Her ability to maneuver, to comb torpedo tracks, to open range from a threat, to maintain tactical position relative to the convoy she is protecting, has been cut by nearly half. Above decks, the fight continues without interruption. The 4 ballistic missiles that were not intercepted at altitude are in terminal phase. The fire control system is managing them with SM-2 Block 3C and coordinating with the destroyer USS Lake, which has been operating 22 miles northwest of the Lake Champlain and which received the full strike group data picture via cooperative engagement capability the moment the first launch was detected. The Lake's SM-2 engages 2 of the 4 terminal phase missiles while the Lake Champlain's depleted but still functional battery addresses the other 2. 3 of the 4 are intercepted. The 4th missile, track designator Sierra 9, completes its terminal phase and impacts the water 600 meters from the nearest logistics vessel. The blast column rises 40 feet. The logistics vessel takes spray across her bow but no structural damage. At 4:24 a.m., the machinery space fire is confirmed extinguished by temperature sensor readings. The space is still full of foam and toxic combustion products and will be for another 20 minutes. The engineering officer of the watch directs the casualty control team to begin ventilation procedures using the portable exhaust equipment from the secondary locker. The team enters the space in SCBA gear at 4:26 a.m. The heat at deck level is still above 140 degrees Celsius. They move through it. What they find in the machinery space is a destruction of equipment that cannot be reversed at sea. The port main reduction gear housing is cracked in 2 places from thermal deformation. The lube oil system has lost 80% of its fluid to the fire and suppression system drainage. The shaft coupling that was sheared by the blast is lodged in the bearing housing at an angle that has damaged the bearing seat itself. This is not a field repair. This is a repair that requires a dry dock and a week of precision machining work. The engineering team documents the damage with a thoroughness born of professional discipline and reports it to Damage Control Central. But they do not stop at documentation. Because there is a second problem, and this one might be solvable. The starboard shaft is operational, but the ship's speed management system is limiting it to 40% output pending a stability assessment following the port shaft loss. The stability assessment is required by procedure because an asymmetric shaft loss can introduce yaw moments that, at high speed, create control difficulties. The assessment takes time. The ship needs speed because the convoy is now 4 miles ahead of the Lake Champlain's reduced speed position, and the tactical geometry of the escort mission requires the cruiser to be able to reach any point of the convoy's perimeter within a specific time window. At 40% starboard output, she cannot do that. The chief engineer runs the stability assessment manually, pulling the ship's inclining data tables from the technical library on the engineering console, and working through the calculation sequence that the naval architectural guidance requires for an asymmetric shaft loss event. The calculation is not complex. It is the kind of problem that a skilled engineer can work through in 10 minutes under normal conditions. But normal conditions do not include a ship motion environment caused by the helmsman maintaining convoy position at reduced speed with a 4-degree list from the stern impact, and the chief engineer braces himself against the console with one forearm and writes the numbers with the other hand. At 4:35 a.m., 11 minutes and 20 seconds after he started, he reports to the bridge that the starboard shaft can be operated at up to 75% output with manual rudder compensation applied at each speed transition. The ship is not back to full capability. but she is back to 19 knots on one shaft, with a manual compensation procedure running continuously, which means the helmsman is making active corrections every time the commanding officer calls for a speed change. For the next 4 hours, the Lake Champlain's helmsman does exactly that. Speed changes are called 18 times during the continued transit to the rendezvous position. Each one requires manual rudder input to prevent the yaw moment from developing into a course deviation. The helmsman does not miss one. The convoy reaches the Abraham Lincoln Strike Group rendezvous at 9:17 a.m. All 4 logistics vessels are intact. Their cargo is intact. The Lake Champlain takes up a holding position 3 miles from the carrier while the replenishment evolution begins, and her crew, which has been at general quarters for 5 hours and 6 minutes, begins the transition to modified watch conditions that allows, for the first time since 4:09 a.m., a portion of the crew to eat and rest while the rest continues the watch. The ship's cook makes scrambled eggs and toast in the galley at 9:45 a.m. Most of the off-watch crew eats standing up in passageways and berthing spaces because the mess decks are being used for a secondary damage assessment meeting between the chief engineer, the damage control assistant, and the department heads. The scrambled eggs are consumed in under 8 minutes. Nobody comments on the taste. Nobody sits down. The Abraham Lincoln's flight deck begins replenishment operations at 10 a.m. Watching it from the Lake Champlain's bridge, the commanding officer can see the carrier's deck crew moving with the practiced efficiency of a team that has been doing this work for 11 consecutive days and whose continued ability to do this work depends, in part, on whether the 4 logistics vessels standing by are actually there. They are there. He watches for 3 minutes and then turns back to the navigation display. The damage assessment submitted to 5th Fleet at 11 a.m. is 11 pages long. Port propulsion plant. Total loss, requiring dry dock repair. Port shaft coupling, destroyed. Main reduction gear case, thermally deformed, requiring replacement. AFFF suppression system in the port machinery space, expended, requiring recharge. SPY-1B transmitter cooling system, flagged for inspection and component replacement during next maintenance availability. SM-3, Block 2. A rounds expended 3. SM-2 Block 3 C rounds expended 4. C-RAM rounds expended 2. Crew injuries. 4 members of the casualty control team treated for heat exposure sustained during initial entry into the machinery space. All 4 returned to duty within 2 hours. The Fattah-2 landed 17 meters short, 17 meters at Mach 8 after a 400-kilometer flight, at 4 in the morning over a dark sea, against a ship that was simultaneously fighting 6 ballistic missiles with a degraded radar. The margin between the outcome that happened and the outcome that would have ended the escort mission, and potentially the convoy itself, was 17 meters of water and a pressure wave that went up through a shaft seal instead of through a hull plate. And still the ship crossed 300 miles of contested water on one shaft, with a helmsman making manual rudder corrections in the dark, and delivered the convoy that kept the Lincoln's flight deck running. The machine can only take you as far as the people running it are willing to go. On the morning of March 9th, they were willing to go all the way.